Sirens cut through the night as a city block folds inward in a single, impossible breath, concrete and glass turning to spray while helicopters try to map the damage through smoke. In the crater's center, a bald man stands with his hands in his pockets, watching soldiers point rifles that mean nothing and a live feed that keeps freezing on his indifferent face as another shockwave tosses cars like toys. Reporters yell questions he does not answer, and crowds run past him as if he were a street lamp. The danger is immediate, widespread, and still unfolding. Within hours, suits from Vought arrive with an offer because if you cannot erase the thing you cannot explain, you attempt to contain it with a signature, and that signature is a seat at the table. Homelander watches a man treat his fury like a bright inconvenience and finds something in his chest that no force can fix, a blankness that cannot be broken by strength. This is only the opening move, and the systems that built control are already rearranging themselves for a conflict that will not stop with rubble. Listen closely. You need to subscribe once to follow this fault line as it widens, because what you're seeing is not a show but a breach that will force decisions with permanent outcomes. Stay for the next chapters. Missing them means missing when institutions fracture and consequences become irreversible. Saitama arrives at a scene that already reads like failure. Emergency lights blink over a crater the size of an intersection. Firefighters peer into smoke where nothing sensible remains, and soldiers arrange themselves into makeshift perimeters around spaces that make no tactical sense. He moves through it like a person walking past an open convenience store, hands in his pockets and expression neutral, and people who are trained to react to monsters find their training collapsing into noise when they see a man who does not look like an answer. Cameras point and feeds freeze on him because the algorithms built to tag threats do not know what to do with someone who radiates boredom instead of danger, and that blankness becomes its own kind of hazard as officials try to compress the night into familiar categories. By the time Vought's crisis teams arrive with a prioritized list of containment protocols, the city has already decided that anything that started the crater is a problem that must be solved instantly. Vought does what it always does when a new variable appears. It assesses, it classifies, and it reaches for its existing playbook, which is to convert threat into spectacle and spectacle into control. Stan Edgar's people are on the ground within the hour, saying the corporate words that smooth panic into press lines, while PR teams filter the footage through approval chains looking for an acceptable frame. A hero saved, a villain neutralized, a narrative closed. Homelander, who has the cameras trained on him even when he is off duty, arrives with the ease of a god who expects the world to be legible and obedient. He descends into the haze like an accusation, cape settling into a practiced gesture, and for the first time in the night, someone who is used to being the apex of spectacle feels the discomfort of not being the center of attention. They meet in public, because Vought understands that control requires optics, and the optics are carefully staged. Microphones are positioned, bodyguards hover, and the conversation is intended to be a simple performance where the problem is absorbed into an existing power dynamic. Homelander's smile is the political tool. It has always been wide, confident, designed to terminate questions, and he opens with a line meant to assert dominance while offering a corporate hand to the chaos. Saitama listens, eyes steady but unfazed, and replies in a voice that carries neither threat nor concern. His tone makes the whole scene feel mildly inconvenient rather than monumental. What Homelander expects, a flinch, a plea for help, a show of reverence, does not arrive, and that absence shifts the room in a way force cannot, because the foundation of Homelander's authority is the reflexive fear and deference of others. The first clash is not a fistfight but a failure of assumptions, and it ripples faster than anything physical could. Homelander tests the obvious lever by demonstrating a calibrated escalation, using flight and a controlled burst of heat vision to intimidate a crowd without actually killing anyone, a display that in other circumstances would reassert the status quo. Saitama watches as if attending to background noise, and when it becomes necessary, he intervenes with a motion so effortless it looks accidental. He taps a fallen beam and sends it shifting in a way that negates the intended spectacle. He redirects debris that would have harmed civilians with a single, casual gesture. And in doing so, he removes the stage that Homelander had built for himself. The effect is immediate and irreversible in social terms. Cameras record the image of the most powerful man in the country being upstaged by someone who refuses the ritual of power. Vaught's analysts see the footage and run it through every predictive model they possess, which is to say they look for a definition they can file. They find none, and that absence forces a different kind of response. Legal and operational teams convene behind closed doors, and the language shifts from containment to recruitment because institutions prefer to fold anomalies into structures rather than let them become unknowns. An offer is composed with corporate precision, benefits, brand alignment, a seat among the seven to absorb public attention and convert it into marketable trust. The calculus is clear and cold. If you cannot stop the thing that breaks the rules, buy it and make it useful. And the decision to approach Saitama is made not because anyone believes it will work, but because doing nothing is politically worse. Homelander watches the offer being drafted and experiences a reaction that cannot be measured in heat or speed. It is a psychological stutter that comes from the realization that not every variable responds to power. He replies publicly with the practiced line of a man who expects compliance, offering performance and protocol, but privately the reaction is different. He paces, he asks for options, and he rehearses 1,000 interventions that might restore the equilibrium he knows how to own. In a briefing room, aides suggest everything from public endorsement to direct intervention, and Homelander listens with that slow, calculating focus that previously reduced resistance to a memory. What unsettles him is not the lack of physical threat, but the absence of recognition. The way Saitama's uninterested posture denies Homelander the one currency he relies on: fear. Saitama accepts the invitation the way someone accepts a cup of tea out of symmetry with a schedule, not because he seeks power or status. He moves through Vaught's corridors with the same detachment he has shown on the street, and the contrast between his ordinariness and the company's self-seriousness becomes a public spectacle in itself. Meetings are held where his boredom is treated like a puzzle, and his answers are cataloged as behavioral anomalies, and executives who have dealt in influence suddenly find themselves discussing how to monetize indifference. There are analysts who propose framing him as a brand of humility, advertising teams who imagine a campaign that normalizes his face as comfort, and security officers who quietly test every system that claims to control a SUP's access. The bureaucracy moves to incorporate him the way a patient hospital trays a new organ for transplantation, careful and efficient because the alternative, an unintegrated variable, is intolerable. The first demonstrative test, arranged with the kind of caution that follows corporate risk assessments, becomes a lesson in how power is rewritten by nonchalance. Vought coordinates a staged rescue for the cameras, complete with simulated threat and contingency teams, and Homelander performs in the way he always has, taking the narrative arc of heroism and making it look inevitable. Saitama intervenes not with spectacle but with a single, unremarkable motion that resolves the manufactured danger before anyone can catalog it, leaving cameras with footage that will not cut into a tidy story. The technicians in the control room scramble to recut frames, to insert the logos and angles that will make the narrative acceptable, but the underlying fact remains. The ritual of scripted heroism no longer guarantees the message markets rely on. Outside, street-level consequences cascade in ways Vought did not account for. Doubt ripples through public reaction, protesters gather with new language, and the social contract that allowed the Seven to function as both brand and authority shows hairline fractures. Homelander's handlers push for a narrative of cooperation, proposing joint appearances that will reassert hierarchy, while others within the company quietly draft contingency plans for reputational damage control. The moment is irreversible because footage exists and witnesses remain, and the city's perception of power has shifted from a simple hierarchy to a network where a single disinterested person can decenter a whole performance. Vought's path forward is now constrained by the choice they made in public and the choice Saitama made in private, and both of those choices have set events into motion that cannot be fully owned back. The night does not end with neat resolutions. Instead, it closes on a series of mobilizations. Homelander leaves the staged venue with a composure that masks other calculations. Vought moves to formalize the invitation into a contract that reads like containment without saying so, and Saitama walks home with groceries, because that is the kind of thing he does afterward. On every screen, the image lingers. A bald man who looks like a neighbor on the same timeline as a man who is worshipped, and the juxtaposition becomes a question the country will have to answer. The first clash over what power means has passed from physical confrontation to an institutional realignment, and the consequences are already spreading outward. The public invitation is staged as a triumph of transparency, with Vought turning the previous night's confusion into a polished announcement that reframes uncertainty as opportunity. A podium is set in the atrium of Vought Tower. Banners are hung with careful symmetry, and a crowd of reporters gathers because anything involving the Seven is still news by default. Edgar stands off to the side with the stillness of a man who understands that control is often exercised through what is not said, while Homelander positions himself front and center with a smile calibrated for reassurance. The message is simple and meant to close the conversation. A new hero has been recognized, and he is being welcomed into the family. Saitama arrives late because he stops for a convenience store drink on the way and forgets the time, which forces the event to stall awkwardly in front of live cameras. Executives whisper into earpieces, producers stretch filler commentary, and Homelander keeps the smile on his face while glancing toward the entrance with growing impatience. When Saitama finally walks in, hands in his pockets and expression neutral, the room's energy shifts without him doing anything to cause it. He looks like someone who wandered into the wrong building by mistake, and that ordinariness disrupts the careful theatricality Vought relies on. Homelander begins the speech with practiced authority, describing Saitama as a powerful ally and a symbol of unity, while Saitama stands beside him staring at a light fixture on the ceiling. The contrast becomes obvious to everyone watching. One man is performing, the other is waiting for it to end. When the microphone is passed to Saitama, he leans toward it and asks if this will take long because he has groceries at home that will go bad. Laughter ripples through the crowd at first, but it fades quickly when they realize he is not joking. A named reaction comes from Starlight, who watches from the side with a mixture of curiosity and concern. She has stood in enough of these events to recognize how carefully each movement is normally choreographed, and she sees the choreography falling apart in real time. Saitama's indifference is not hostile, but it refuses to cooperate with the script, and that refusal exposes how much of Vought's authority depends on performance. She glances at Homelander and notices something tightening behind his smile. Homelander attempts to regain control by guiding the conversation into familiar territory, asking Saitama about his commitment to protecting the public and his willingness to serve as a symbol of hope. Saitama answers honestly and casually, saying he just helps out when things get annoying and doesn't really think about symbols. The words are harmless on their own, but they dismantle the grand narrative Homelander is trying to build around him. Cameras capture the exchange, and viewers at home begin to see a dynamic that Vought did not intend to show. Vought's PR team scramble behind the scenes, editing live feeds and signaling for the event to wrap early, but the damage is already done. Clips of Saitama's blunt replies spread across social media faster than the company can contain them, and people begin reacting not with fear or awe, but with amusement and curiosity. The public has never seen someone stand next to Homelander without trying to impress him or submit to him. That novelty becomes the story. Billy Butcher watches the broadcast from a dim apartment and realizes immediately that this is not a normal recruitment. He sees how Homelander's authority is being undercut by something as simple as disinterest, and he recognizes that this man is dangerous in a way that has nothing to do with strength. Butcher understands people who crave power and people who fear it, but he has never seen someone who treats it like background noise. The thought unsettles him more than any soup display he has witnessed. The first real escalation happens when a genuine emergency interrupts the event. A call comes in about a collapsing parking structure a few blocks away, and the control room signals Homelander for a live response that will salvage the narrative. Homelander seizes the opportunity, announcing to cameras that he and the newest member of the Seven will handle the situation together. The crowd cheers, relieved to see a return to familiar heroics. They arrive at the scene to find dust and panicked civilians, and Homelander launches into action with dramatic speed, lifting debris and shouting commands for cameras to follow. Saitama walks behind him at a normal pace, looking around as if trying to figure out where he is supposed to stand. A support column begins to give way, threatening to bring the entire structure down, and before Homelander can finish a sentence about evacuations, Saitama casually taps the column back into place with one hand. The motion is so effortless it looks like he is adjusting furniture. The building stabilizes instantly, and the crisis ends before Homelander has a chance to complete the heroic arc he started. Reporters struggle to narrate what just happened because there was no visible struggle, no dramatic rescue, only a quiet correction. Civilians stare at Saitama with confusion rather than awe, unsure whether they witnessed something extraordinary or mundane. The cameras capture Homelander standing in a cloud of dust while Saitama asks if this means they can go back now. A named reaction comes from A-Train, who watches the footage later in the tower's lounge. He recognizes that the usual rhythm of heroism has been disrupted, and that Homelander looks like a supporting character in his own rescue. He laughs nervously at first, then stops when he realizes no one else finds it funny. The dynamic inside the Seven has shifted without anyone acknowledging it directly. Homelander returns to the tower visibly composed but internally unsettled, and he requests a private meeting with Stan Edgar. He speaks in measured tones about maintaining order and controlling narratives, but the subtext is clear. Saitama's presence is destabilizing the hierarchy that Homelander relies on. Edgar listens without interruption, his expression unreadable, because he understands that the real issue is not Saitama's power, but the way he ignores the structure that gives Vought leverage. For the first time, Homelander is asking for help against something he cannot intimidate. Saitama, meanwhile, wanders through the tower's cafeteria looking for snacks, unaware that his casual actions are being analyzed by multiple departments at once. Employees watch him pass with a mix of curiosity and relief, sensing that he is different from the sups they are used to navigating around. He sits alone at a table, eating quietly while screens around him replay footage of the parking structure incident on loop. He glances up once, shrugs, and goes back to his food. By the end of the day, the public invitation has achieved the opposite of its intended purpose. Instead of reinforcing Vaught's control over the narrative, it has introduced a variable that cannot be framed or marketed cleanly. Homelander feels the shift in how people look at him, and Vought feels it in the way conversations inside the building have changed tone. Saitama remains completely unaffected, treating the entire situation like an inconvenient errand he agreed to out of boredom. The situation does not settle into calm. Instead, it sets a new tension into motion as Vought begins drafting stricter protocols for Saitama's involvement, and Homelander begins watching him with a focus that borders on obsession. What was meant to be a simple recruitment has become a slow unraveling of how power is understood inside the tower. The next step will not be about public appearances, but about whether the system can adapt to someone who refuses to acknowledge it. Vaught's systemic response begins the moment the cameras stop framing Saitama as an asset and start revealing him as a liability to the narrative. Departments that usually operate independently are pulled into a single chain of command focused on one objective: understand how to integrate someone who does not behave like a soup. Schedules are drafted for media training he does not attend. Behavioral assessments are commissioned based on footage rather than interviews, and entire teams are assigned to monitor his movements through the building without being obvious about it. The goal is not to control him yet, but to map him. Edgar oversees the process with calm efficiency, asking questions that reveal more about the company than about Saitama. He wants to know how a system built on fear, admiration, and marketability responds to a person who generates none of those reactions reliably. Reports come back filled with contradictions. Employees say they feel at ease around him. Security notes that he ignores boundaries without meaning to, and PR teams admit they cannot predict what he will say in public. Edgar understands that unpredictability is a threat to any institution that depends on consistent performance. A named reaction comes from Ashley Barrett, who is tasked with coordinating Saitama's public appearances. She spends an entire afternoon trying to explain brand alignment to him, outlining how his image needs to fit within the Seven's established identities. Saitama listens politely for a few minutes before asking if he can skip all of it because it sounds like extra work. Ashley leaves the meeting visibly shaken, not because he was rude, but because he did not acknowledge the importance of what she was saying at all. Homelander's reaction is more personal and less procedural. He begins appearing wherever Saitama is in the building, pretending the encounters are casual while studying how he moves and speaks. He asks pointed questions disguised as friendly conversation, trying to find something that reveals ambition or insecurity. Each time, Saitama answers in a way that feels honest and unguarded, which frustrates Homelander because there is nothing to exploit. The lack of leverage becomes a silent challenge he cannot solve. Vought attempts to regain control through structure by assigning Saitama to routine patrols with other members of the Seven. The idea is that shared experiences will normalize him within the team and re-establish familiar dynamics. During the first patrol, Starlight tries to explain how they coordinate responses and prioritize threats, only to watch Saitama solve a minor incident by moving a stuck bus out of the road with one hand before she finishes her sentence. The efficiency is helpful, but undermines the need for coordination, making the entire exercise feel unnecessary. The escalation becomes evident when Vought realizes that Saitama's presence is altering how civilians react to the Seven. People approach him directly with small problems they would never bring to Homelander, asking for help with trivial issues because he seems approachable. Homelander notices this immediately during a public walkthrough and watches as attention drifts away from him towards someone who is not trying to command it. The shift is subtle but unmistakable. Billy Butcher observes the same phenomenon from a distance and begins to reassess his understanding of Vaught's grip on the public. He sees how easily people gravitate towards Saitama without fear or awe, and he realizes that this dynamic weakens the psychological hold the Seven have maintained for years. Butcher does not trust Saitama, but he recognizes that his indifference is disrupting the system in ways Butcher could never achieve through confrontation. Inside Vought, security protocols tighten quietly around Saitama. Access badges are adjusted, surveillance coverage is increased, and analysts track his movements through the building to predict patterns. They are not trying to stop him, but they are trying to understand where he fits in a structure designed for subs who crave attention. The more data they collect, the clearer it becomes that he does not follow any of the behavioral models they rely on. A named reaction comes from Queen Maeve, who watches Saitama during a team briefing and notices how little he reacts to Homelander's presence. She has spent years navigating the tension of standing beside someone who demands constant validation, and seeing Saitama treat that demand like background noise is strangely liberating. For the first time in a long while, she feels less pressure simply by being in the same room as him. Vought's corporate solution shifts from integration to containment. Meetings are held about limiting Saitama's unscripted appearances and redirecting public attention back toward controlled narratives. They propose pairing him only with specific team members and restricting his access to live media events. The language becomes careful, but the intention is clear. Minimize the disruption without making it obvious. Saitama remains unaware of the planning around him. He spends most of his time wandering the building, occasionally asking where the nearest convenience store is, and leaving early when meetings drag on too long. Employees begin to anticipate his movements with a kind of quiet amusement, sensing that he operates outside the tension that defines their daily work. His presence makes the building feel less oppressive without him trying to. Homelander feels the shift intensify as Vought begins making decisions about Saitama without consulting him. He recognizes that the company is trying to manage a situation it does not fully understand, and that this management reduces his own influence over the team. The frustration builds slowly, turning into a quiet obsession with proving that he still defines what the Seven are. By the end of the day, Vought's systemic response has transformed from welcoming Saitama into the Seven to trying to protect the Seven from the effects of Saitama. The structure of the company begins bending around him in small, noticeable ways, and those bends create new tensions that did not exist before. The system is no longer stable because it cannot categorize the man at its center. The city-wide consequences begin quietly, not with explosions or disasters, but with a noticeable drop in the kind of chaos that usually fills Vought's emergency dashboards. Dispatch centers report fewer escalating incidents because problems are being resolved before they turn into headlines, and no one can quite explain how. Civilians start telling stories online about a bald guy in a yellow suit who helped them move a stalled car, carried groceries for an elderly woman, or casually lifted debris after a minor accident without waiting for cameras. None of these moments are dramatic enough to trend on their own, but together they form a pattern that spreads across neighborhoods. Vought notices the pattern before the city does. Analysts flag the increase in unscheduled appearances and correlate them with a decline in incidents that would normally generate positive publicity for the Seven. The company has always relied on visible heroics to maintain relevance, and now those heroics are being replaced by small, unrecorded acts that do not fit their model. Meetings are called to discuss how to redirect attention back toward structured responses, but no one can figure out how to schedule spontaneity. A named reaction comes from Starlight when she walks through a district that usually requires a visible security presence and finds people relaxed instead of tense. Shop owners greet her politely but mention that other guy already helped earlier in the day. She realizes that Saitama's casual involvement is reshaping how people think about safety, making it feel personal rather than theatrical. The shift is subtle but powerful, and she cannot decide whether it is comforting or destabilizing. Homelander experiences the same change as a loss of control over his own environment. He flies over the city expecting to see familiar patterns of disorder that justify his presence, but the streets look calmer than usual. When he lands at a minor disturbance, he finds Saitama already there, standing off to the side while the situation resolves itself. Homelander watches as civilians thank Saitama casually, without the awe or fear he is used to commanding, and something inside him tightens further. Billy Butcher hears about the sightings through his own network and begins tracking them like a different kind of threat. He notices that Saitama appears wherever tension might have grown into something Vought could exploit, and that those opportunities are disappearing quietly. Butcher understands how much Vought depends on crises to justify its power, and he realizes that Saitama is accidentally undermining that structure without even trying. The escalation becomes visible when local news stations start covering the phenomenon as a human interest story. Reporters interview residents who describe how the bald hero helped them with everyday problems, and the tone of the coverage is warmer than anything Vought normally produces. There are no dramatic rescues, just people feeling safer in ordinary moments. The story spreads because it feels genuine, and that genuineness is something Vought cannot manufacture. Inside Vought Tower, executives watch the coverage with growing discomfort. Their carefully curated image of heroism is being replaced by something informal and uncontrollable. Attempts to schedule Saitama for official appearances fail because he either forgets or leaves early, and the contrast between his casual acts and the 7 staged events becomes harder to ignore. The company begins to realize that the narrative is shifting away from spectacle toward authenticity. A named reaction comes from Queen Maeve, who notices that public hostility toward the 7 has softened slightly in areas where Saitama has been seen. People seem less afraid and more willing to engage, which changes the atmosphere of public appearances. She recognizes that this change is not coming from Vaught's messaging but from Saitama's presence, and it makes her question how much of her own career has been built on fear rather than trust. Homelander's frustration reaches a new level when he hears civilians refer to Saitama simply as that guy, instead of using titles or branding. The lack of reverence feels like a personal insult, because it highlights how much he depends on recognition to define himself. He begins confronting Saitama more directly, asking why he interferes with situations that do not require his involvement. Saitama replies that he was just nearby and thought it would be quicker to help. The city continues adapting to this new dynamic without realizing it is doing so. People start expecting small problems to be resolved without drama, and they become less reliant on calling the 7 for every disturbance. Emergency calls drop slightly, traffic moves more smoothly, and everyday life feels marginally easier. The change is so gradual that most residents do not notice it consciously. Vaught's response shifts from containment to concern as they realize their relevance is being diluted. Marketing teams propose campaigns to align the 7 with Saitama's style, but the attempt feels forced and artificial. Executives debate whether to limit his movement through the city, but they know any visible restriction would raise more questions than it answers. The system is losing control over the narrative it depends on. By the end of the day, the city feels different in a way that cannot be traced to a single event. Homelander senses the shift every time he steps into public view and finds less fear waiting for him. Vought senses it in the way their metrics no longer predict public reaction accurately. Saitama, meanwhile, buys discounted groceries and walks home, unaware that his casual presence has begun reshaping how an entire city understands power and safety. Military and governmental attention does not arrive with sirens or headlines. It begins with quiet briefings where analysts present data that does not fit existing categories. Emergency response times are improving in areas where no official upgrades have been made. Civilian complaints are dropping in districts known for unrest, and sightings of a single individual correlate with subtle shifts in public behavior. Officials who once focused exclusively on Vought now find themselves discussing a variable that exists outside the company's control. The conclusion forms slowly but clearly. This is no longer just a corporate matter. In Washington, a closed session brings together representatives from defense, intelligence, and internal security to review compiled footage of Saitama's unscripted appearances. They watch clips of him lifting debris, redirecting traffic, and casually resolving situations that normally require coordinated effort. What unsettles them is not the scale of what he does, but the ease and indifference with which he does it. A question emerges that no one can answer. How do you manage someone who is not trying to be managed? Inside Vought Tower, Sung Jinwoo is nowhere in this story. Instead, Saitama sits in a cafeteria chair eating chips while shadows of attention gather around him from outside the company's walls. Vought learns about the government interest through back channels and immediately shifts into damage control mode, framing Saitama as a cooperative member of the 7 rather than an independent factor. Meetings multiply as executives debate how to present him as part of the system rather than outside it. The more they talk, the clearer it becomes that they do not understand him well enough to speak for him. A named reaction comes from Starlight when she overhears a conversation about federal observers being placed near Vought properties. She realizes that the focus is not on Vought's usual scandals, but on Saitama's influence on the city. The idea that outside authorities are watching him with the same curiosity she feels makes her uneasy. She begins to sense that the situation is expanding beyond corporate control. Homelander reacts with visible irritation when he learns that government agencies are requesting briefings about Saitama without going through him. He has always been the point of contact for national concerns involving SUPs, and being bypassed feels like a deliberate slight. He confronts Vought executives, demanding to know why his authority is being diluted, and receives answers that sound like excuses. The more he hears Saitama's name in official conversations, the more he feels his own relevance slipping. Billy Butcher hears about the federal interest through unofficial channels and recognizes the pattern immediately. Governments do not pay attention to individuals unless they represent a shift in power they cannot ignore. He begins watching Saitama more closely, not because he fears him, but because he senses that this man is altering the balance Butcher has spent years fighting against. The thought that change might come from indifference rather than rebellion unsettles him. The escalation becomes visible when a small team of government observers arrives at Vought Tower under the pretense of routine evaluation. They are polite, professional, and clearly there for one reason. Cameras track their movement through the building as they request access to footage and schedules related to Saitama's activities. Vought complies outwardly while internally scrambling to limit how much they reveal. Saitama notices the observers only because they block his path to the vending machine. They attempt to introduce themselves and explain their purpose, but he nods absent-mindedly and asks if they know where the soda is. The interaction leaves the observers visibly confused because they were prepared for arrogance, hostility, or caution, not casual disinterest. They report back that he does not behave like any soup they have studied. A named reaction comes from Queen Maeve, who watches the exchange and realizes that Saitama's indifference is beginning to affect how outsiders perceive the Seven. The observers look less intimidated and more curious than she has ever seen government agents behave around SUPs. She understands that this shift could have long-term consequences for how authority is negotiated. Vought attempts to regain control by arranging a formal meeting between Saitama and government representatives in a controlled environment. The room is prepared with careful attention to optics, but the conversation derails almost immediately when Saitama admits he does not really understand why everyone is making such a big deal. He answers questions honestly and simply, describing his actions as things he does when he is bored or nearby. The officials leave the meeting with more questions than answers. By the end of the day, government interest has moved from observation to concern. Internal memos circulate describing Saitama as a stabilizing influence that operates independently of any oversight, which makes him both valuable and unpredictable. Discussions begin about whether cooperation is possible or if contingency plans should be developed quietly. The situation has crossed from curiosity into strategic consideration. Saitama leaves the building early to catch a sale at a grocery store, unaware that his casual movements are now being tracked by people who view him as a national factor. Homelander watches him go with growing unease, recognizing that the world is beginning to revolve around someone who does not even realize he is at the center of attention. The focus on Saitama is no longer a corporate inconvenience. It is becoming a matter of state. International attention does not arrive through headlines at first, but through diplomatic cables and intelligence briefings that pass quietly between governments. Reports from foreign observers begin to mirror what domestic agencies have already seen. Incidents resolving themselves when Saitama is nearby, large-scale problems shrinking into inconveniences without official intervention. Analysts struggle to explain how one individual can alter patterns across a city without making any deliberate effort to do so. The question shifts from who he is to what his presence means on a global scale. At Vought Tower, executives begin receiving inquiries from overseas partners who want clarification about Saitama's role within the Seven. The tone of these messages is polite but carries an undercurrent of urgency, as if other nations are trying to determine whether this new variable belongs to America alone. Vought attempts to reassure them with carefully worded statements that frame Saitama as part of their controlled structure. The more they repeat this claim, the more fragile it sounds. Homelander becomes aware that foreign governments are requesting briefings about Saitama specifically, and the realization hits him harder than any confrontation so far. He has always been the symbol of American dominance, the figure presented to the world as unmatched and irreplaceable. Now he watches as attention shifts to a man who does not even attend the meetings meant to discuss him. The psychological weight of being quietly displaced begins to show in his expressions and tone. A named reaction comes from A-Train, who overhears staff discussing how Saitama's footage is being circulated in international defense circles. He realizes that this is no longer a local situation and begins to feel uneasy about how little he understands what is happening. The idea that global agencies are studying Saitama like a natural phenomenon unsettles him more than any threat he has faced. Military analysts from multiple countries start comparing data, noting that Saitama's involvement correlates with lower collateral damage and faster resolution in high-risk incidents. Some begin to see him not as a weapon, but as a stabilizer, an anomaly that reduces chaos simply by existing. Others view him as a potential threat that cannot be measured or predicted. These conflicting interpretations create tension in strategic discussions across borders. Vought tries to regain narrative control by scheduling a global press event that highlights the Seven as a unified team, hoping to dilute the focus on Saitama. The event falls apart quietly when Saitama spends most of it looking at his phone and asking when it will be over. Cameras capture his indifference, and the footage spreads quickly online, further confusing the narrative Vought is trying to maintain. Instead of looking like a controlled asset, he appears completely detached from the system presenting him. Billy Butcher watches the international coverage with growing interest, recognizing that this situation is evolving beyond anything he has planned for. He begins to see Saitama not as an enemy or ally, but as a catalyst that is forcing institutions to reveal their priorities. The fact that governments are debating how to categorize him tells Butcher that the balance of power is shifting in ways no one can fully grasp yet. The escalation becomes undeniable when a joint military task force requests a direct observation of Saitama during a routine patrol. Vought cannot refuse without raising suspicion, so they arrange for the task force to accompany him discreetly. The soldiers expect to witness a display of power or strategy, but instead they watch Saitama casually fix minor problems and ignore situations that do not interest him. Their reports describe him as both extraordinary and strangely ordinary. A named reaction comes from Queen Maeve, who notices how the soldiers treat Saitama with a mixture of caution and curiosity rather than fear. She understands that this shift in perception could change how SUPs are viewed globally. The realization that respect is replacing intimidation alters her own perspective on what power means. Homelander attempts to reassert his position by staging a high-profile intervention in front of international cameras, hopping to remind everyone of his dominance. The effort feels forced and overly dramatic compared to Saitama's quiet actions, and the contrast is obvious to anyone watching. The more Homelander tries to prove his relevance, the more he appears to be competing with someone who is not competing at all. By the end of the week, global agencies are discussing Saitama in terms usually reserved for natural disasters or rare phenomena. Contingency plans are drafted not to confront him, but to understand what would happen if he chose to act in ways they cannot predict. The world is beginning to treat him as a constant variable that must be accounted for in every calculation. Saitama remains unaware of the scale of these discussions, focused instead on everyday concerns that seem trivial compared to the attention surrounding him. He continues to move through the city with the same casual indifference, solving problems when they are directly in front of him and ignoring everything else. His behavior, unchanged by the growing scrutiny, only deepens the sense that he operates outside any system trying to define him. The irreversible shift becomes clear when multiple governments formally request cooperative agreements with Vought specifically regarding Saitama's activities. What was once a corporate matter is now an international one, and Vought finds itself negotiating over something it does not truly control. The balance of power has expanded beyond borders, and Saitama's presence is now a global concern. Inside Vought Tower, the atmosphere begins to change in ways that are difficult to describe but impossible to ignore. Meetings that once revolved around public image and coordinated hero work now drift into uneasy discussions about Saitama's unpredictable presence and the way it quietly reshapes every plan. Staff members notice that scheduling conflicts increase whenever Saitama is involved, as if the normal rhythm of operations can no longer adjust around him. The organization still functions, but it does so with a subtle hesitation that spreads from office to office. A named reaction comes from Queen Maeve, who starts questioning why she feels less pressure during missions when Saitama is nearby. She realizes that his indifference creates a strange sense of relief, because situations resolve themselves without the usual fear of escalation. This realization makes her reevaluate her own role within the Seven, and for the first time she considers what it would be like to operate without Vaught's constant direction. Atrain notices a different effect. He begins to feel irrelevant during team operations, not because Saitama is outperforming him, but because Saitama does not seem to recognize the hierarchy that Atrain has always relied on. The absence of competition unsettles him more than any rivalry ever could, and he starts questioning whether speed and spectacle still matter in a world where problems simply disappear around one man. The Deep reacts with quiet anxiety, sensing that the group's dynamic is slipping out of familiar patterns. He watches conversations stall when Saitama enters a room and notices how everyone subtly shifts their behavior, unsure how to act around someone who treats them all the same. The lack of social cues leaves him uncomfortable, and he begins avoiding common areas to escape the tension. Homelander experiences the fracture more intensely than anyone. He observes how team briefings lose focus whenever Saitama casually interrupts with mundane comments or walks out before plans are finished. The authority Homelander once exercised through presence alone now feels diluted by someone who does not acknowledge it. Each interaction leaves him more unsettled, because he cannot find a way to assert control without looking desperate. Billy Butcher watches from the outside as the Seven's cohesion weakens, recognizing that this is not the result of conflict, but of quiet displacement. He notes how public footage shows fewer coordinated appearances and more isolated actions by individual members. To Butcher, this looks like an organization losing its center of gravity without realizing why. During a routine rescue operation, the fracture becomes visible to the public. The Seven arrive together, but Saitama wanders off to address a minor issue while the others focus on the main event. By the time they regroup, the crisis has already resolved itself in unexpected ways, leaving the rest of the team standing around without anything meaningful to do. Cameras capture their confusion, and the footage spreads quickly. A named reaction comes from Starlight, who begins to question whether the team's purpose has shifted entirely. She notices how people in the crowd are looking past the Seven to find Saitama, not out of admiration, but out of curiosity. This change in attention makes her realize that their symbolic role is eroding in real time. Vought attempts to address the situation by restructuring team assignments, hopping to restore a sense of order. The effort only highlights how much their plans now revolve around accommodating Saitama's unpredictability. Staff members quietly admit that they are planning around someone who does not follow any plan. Homelander tries to reassert unity by calling for a private team meeting, expecting to restore discipline through direct conversation. The meeting dissolves when Saitama spends most of it asking practical questions about when they will be finished. The others exchange glances that reveal their growing discomfort, and Homelander leaves the room more frustrated than before. The irreversible escalation comes when several members begin requesting solo assignments more frequently, citing efficiency and personal preference. Vought approves these requests without realizing they are enabling the team's gradual separation. What was once a coordinated group begins to operate like individuals sharing a name but not a purpose. By the end of the week, the seven no longer feel like a unified entity. They still appear together in public when required, but the cohesion that once defined them has quietly dissolved. Saitama's presence has not destroyed the team through conflict. It has simply made the need for it less obvious. Homelander does not break in a single moment. He begins to erode in small, private ways that no camera captures. He spends longer periods alone in rooms where screens replay footage of Saitama moving through the city without urgency or concern. What unsettles him is not what Saitama does, but how little he seems to think about doing it. The absence of intention feels like a challenge Homelander cannot answer with strength. A named reaction comes from Ashley, who notices that Homelander has started asking for reports about Saitama that contain no actionable information. He reads them anyway, searching for something that might explain how to approach him. Each report only confirms the same thing. Saitama does not operate on motivations Homelander understands. During public appearances, Homelander tries to recapture attention by speaking more forcefully and standing closer to cameras, but the effect is diminished. Viewers comment online about how calm Saitama looks beside him, and how that calmness makes Homelander seem unusually tense. The comparison spreads quietly, feeding a narrative Homelander cannot control. In a private hallway encounter, Homelander confronts Saitama directly, attempting to provoke some kind of reaction. He speaks about responsibility, power, and what it means to lead the seven, expecting at least mild acknowledgement. Saitama listens, nods once, and asks if Homelander knows where the cafeteria moved the snack machines. The conversation ends there, leaving Homelander standing in silence. Billy Butcher observes these interactions from a distance and recognizes the pattern immediately. He has spent years trying to provoke Homelander into losing control, and now he watches someone dismantle that control simply by not engaging. The realization both amuses and unsettles him, because it reveals a weakness he never anticipated. A named reaction comes from Queen Maeve, who sees how Homelander's tone changes after these encounters. He speaks less during briefings and reacts more sharply to minor inconveniences. She understands that his frustration is not directed at Saitama's actions, but at his inability to affect him in any way. The escalation becomes visible when Homelander begins inserting himself into situations where Saitama is present, trying to create opportunities to demonstrate authority. Each attempt falls flat because Saitama treats these interventions as background noise. The more Homelander tries to assert dominance, the more invisible he feels. Vought notices the change in Homelander's behavior and quietly assigns staff to monitor his mood, concerned that the psychological strain could become a public issue. They discuss ways to reduce his exposure to Saitama, but practical considerations make this impossible. Saitama's unpredictability means they cannot schedule around him. During a live broadcast, Homelander pauses mid-sentence when he notices Saitama in the background helping a civilian with a trivial problem. The camera lingers just long enough for viewers to see the contrast between Homelander's intensity and Saitama's casual demeanor. The clip circulates widely, reinforcing the perception that something fundamental has shifted. Homelander watches the footage later in private and realizes that he no longer looks like the center of attention in his own world. The awareness hits him harder than any confrontation, because it cannot be solved through force. He begins to understand that Saitama's greatest impact is not physical but psychological. The irreversible escalation occurs when Homelander stops trying to compete openly and instead withdraws into a quieter, more watchful state. He spends hours observing Saitama from a distance, trying to understand a pattern that does not exist. This withdrawal creates a vacuum in the Seven's leadership that no one steps forward to fill. By the end of the week, Homelander's confidence has been replaced by a constant, low-level unease. He no longer knows how to position himself in relation to someone who does not recognize his authority. The psychological balance that once defined him has begun to tilt in a direction he cannot correct. The first irreversible decisions are not announced publicly. They appear as quiet adjustments in policy and language across agencies that once deferred automatically to Vought. Internal memos begin referring to Saitama as an independent factor rather than a member of the Seven, and contingency planning shifts accordingly. What started as curiosity becomes a framework for action, built on the assumption that Saitama cannot be directed through corporate channels. This change happens faster than Vought can track. A named reaction comes from Starlight, who notices that requests for her involvement in joint operations now arrive from government offices instead of Vought coordinators. She realizes that the chain of authority is rerouting around the company without any official announcement. The implication is clear: trust in Vought's control has eroded. Homelander senses this shift before anyone explains it to him. He begins receiving fewer direct calls from officials who once consulted him on every major incident, replaced by formal briefings that feel impersonal and distant. The loss of informal authority unsettles him more than any confrontation could. He understands that influence is being redistributed quietly. Vought responds by attempting to reassert its relevance through public statements emphasizing cooperation and oversight. The effort only highlights how little control they actually have over Saitama's actions. Each statement sounds increasingly hollow as footage continues to show him operating without reference to any directive. Billy Butcher observes the institutional changes with interest, recognizing that systems rarely alter themselves without pressure. He sees how Saitama's indifference has forced governments to reconsider their reliance on Vought structure. The realization that power can shift without violence fascinates him. The escalation becomes concrete when a federal directive is issued requiring direct reporting on Saitama's activities to multiple agencies simultaneously. Vought is informed after the fact, treated more as a data source than an authority. The directive formalizes what had already begun informally. Saitama is now a matter of state oversight. A named reaction comes from Queen Maeve, who reads the directive and understands that the Seven's role as intermediaries between Vought and the government is dissolving. She recognizes that their symbolic function is being replaced by direct observation of Saitama himself. This realization changes how she views her place within the group. Saitama remains unaware of these developments, continuing his routine with the same casual indifference. He notices that more people ask him questions during patrols, but he answers them briefly and moves on. His behavior does not change, which only deepens the concern of those trying to categorize him. Homelander attempts one final effort to reestablish his position by proposing a coordinated operation that places him at the center of attention. The plan is approved, but receives minimal interest from outside agencies, who focus instead on whether Saitama will be present. The contrast is impossible to ignore. The irreversible shift occurs when multiple departments begin drafting long-term strategies that assume Saitama's continued presence as a stabilizing force. These plans treat him not as a participant, but as a constant in the environment, something to be accounted for rather than directed. The system has adapted around him without his involvement. By the end of the week, Vought's authority has been quietly reduced in areas where it once held unquestioned influence. The company still operates, but it no longer defines how SUPs are managed at the highest levels. Saitama's presence has forced a structural change that cannot be undone. Public perception does not shift with a single broadcast or headline. It changes through hundreds of small moments that accumulate across days. People begin sharing clips of Saitama walking through crises with the same expression he has in grocery stores, and the contrast with staged heroics becomes impossible to ignore. Comment sections fill with observations about how calm he looks in situations that once felt terrifying. The idea of what a hero should be starts to loosen quietly. A named reaction comes from Starlight, who notices that crowds now ask her about Saitama more than they ask for autographs. They are not praising him in the usual way. They are trying to understand him. She realizes that people are no longer looking for spectacle, but for reassurance that someone unbothered by power is nearby. Vought attempts to redirect attention with carefully produced content highlighting traditional hero narratives, but engagement continues drifting toward unfiltered footage of Saitama's casual interventions. The more Vought emphasizes drama, the more the public gravitates toward simplicity. Marketing strategies that once guaranteed attention begin to fail without explanation. Homelander watches this shift with growing discomfort as his own public appearances receive less enthusiastic responses. He notices that people seem calmer around him, less awed and less afraid, as if Saitama's presence has changed the emotional baseline. The loss of intensity in these interactions feels like a personal diminishment. Billy Butcher observes the trend with a mixture of surprise and cautious optimism. He sees how Saitama's indifference is eroding the fear that Vought has relied on for years. The fact that this change comes from casual behavior rather than deliberate rebellion fascinates him. The escalation becomes visible when media outlets begin discussing Saitama as a new kind of figure, someone who does not fit into existing categories of hero or celebrity. Analysts struggle to describe why his presence feels comforting rather than intimidating. This conversation spreads quickly, reshaping expectations across audiences. A named reaction comes from Queen Maeve, who realizes that she feels less pressure during public appearances because the crowd's focus is no longer on maintaining an image. She senses that the symbolic weight the Seven once carried is lightening. This shift changes how she views her own future. Saitama continues to behave the same way he always has, unaware that his casual demeanor is influencing millions of people. He responds to questions with simple answers and avoids extended conversations whenever possible. His consistency reinforces the perception that he is genuine in a way others are not. Vaught's attempts to reclaim narrative control grow increasingly desperate, but each effort only highlights how much the public mood has changed. Carefully scripted appearances feel artificial next to Saitama's unplanned presence. The contrast becomes a topic of discussion in its own right. The irreversible change occurs when surveys show a measurable drop in public fear associated with soup activity in areas where Saitama frequently appears. Analysts struggle to explain the data, but the conclusion is clear. People feel safer not because of strength, but because of calm. This new perception cannot be easily reversed. By the end of the week, the idea of what it means to be powerful has shifted in the public mind. Saitama has not tried to redefine anything, but his presence has quietly done so anyway. The world's expectations have changed, and they will not return to what they were. Institutions do not panic loudly. They tighten quietly when they sense control slipping beyond their reach. Internal meetings across agencies shift in tone from observation to urgency, and language that once described Saitama as an anomaly begins to frame him as a destabilizing factor. The realization spreads that public perception is moving faster than official narratives can keep up. Plans are drafted not to understand him, but to regain authority in a world where authority feels diluted. A named reaction comes from Ashley, who notices how Vaught's executive floors remain lit late into the night as teams scramble to produce strategies that no longer seem relevant. She hears phrases like, containment of narrative and reasserting structure, repeated in meetings that produce no clear outcomes. The more they talk, the more obvious it becomes that the situation cannot be solved through marketing. Homelander feels the tightening atmosphere in the way people speak around him, more cautious and less certain than before. He realizes that institutions are trying to solve a problem without including him in the solution. The exclusion deepens his sense that his role is shrinking in ways he cannot reverse. Billy Butcher watches as government responses grow more formal and less theatrical, recognizing the signs of systems trying to protect themselves. He sees how agencies begin coordinating without Vought, sharing information directly and bypassing established channels. This quiet cooperation tells him that the balance of power has shifted permanently. The escalation becomes visible when new guidelines are issued for how SUPs are to be observed and documented, with special attention given to Saitama's movements. These guidelines are framed as safety measures, but function as attempts to regain oversight. The effort highlights how little control exists in practice. A named reaction comes from Starlight, who reads the guidelines and realizes that the system is reacting out of fear rather than strategy. She senses that institutions are trying to build structure around something that refuses to fit inside it. This realization strengthens her growing doubts about Vaught's future. Vought attempts one final public initiative designed to showcase unity and leadership, but the event feels hollow from the start. Saitama attends only because he has nothing better to do, and his casual presence undermines the seriousness of the message being delivered. The contrast is so obvious that even viewers at home notice the disconnect. Homelander tries to use the event to reassert his importance, but the audience's attention drifts toward Saitama's unbothered expressions. The more Homelander emphasizes control, the more it seems to slip away. He begins to understand that this is not a battle he can win through force or charisma. The irreversible shift occurs when internal reports conclude that restoring the previous balance of authority is no longer possible without drastic measures that no one is willing to attempt. Institutions accept, quietly, that they must adapt to a world where Saitama exists outside their influence. This acceptance marks a point of no return. By the end of the week, the atmosphere inside Vought and across agencies feels subdued, as if everyone is waiting for something they cannot define. Control has not been taken by Saitama, it has simply faded from the hands that once held it. The system is still standing, but it no longer knows how to function the way it used to. Morning arrives with a strange calm that feels unfamiliar to everyone who has been watching the slow unraveling of the past weeks. Traffic moves normally, news broadcasts resume their usual rhythms, and Vought Tower stands as tall as ever against the skyline. On the surface, the world looks unchanged, but the conversations happening behind closed doors reveal how deeply the ground has shifted. No one is talking about restoring the old order anymore. They are discussing how to live with a new one. Inside Vought, executives meet not to plan campaigns, but to redefine their purpose in a landscape where they are no longer the primary authority over SUPs. The language in these meetings is cautious and subdued, focused on cooperation rather than control. For the first time, Vought speaks about adapting to external oversight instead of resisting it. The company that once dictated terms now negotiates them. A named reaction comes from Queen Maeve, who walks through the halls and notices how the tension she once felt here has thinned into something quieter. She realizes that the pressure to perform a role she never fully believed in has eased. This change makes her consider a future where she is not defined by Vaught's expectations. Homelander moves through the building with a reserved demeanor that would have seemed impossible before. He watches as staff members carry on with their tasks without the same urgency that once surrounded him. The realization settles in that the world is continuing without centering itself around his presence. Billy Butcher observes the broader picture from outside, recognizing that the system he fought for years to disrupt has been altered by someone who never intended to challenge it. He understands that this shift is not temporary, because it is rooted in how people now think and feel rather than in any specific event. The change is psychological and therefore lasting. Saitama sits on a bench outside a convenience store, eating a snack and looking mildly bored as the city moves around him. People pass by without fear or excitement, treating him like a familiar part of the environment rather than a spectacle. He notices none of the significance in this, only that the weather is pleasant. A named reaction comes from Starlight, who sees Saitama there and recognizes how ordinary the moment feels despite everything that has happened. She realizes that his greatest impact has been making extraordinary power feel unremarkable. This understanding gives her a sense of clarity she has not felt in years. Government agencies continue their work with new frameworks that assume Saitama's presence as a constant rather than an anomaly. Policies reflect cooperation instead of control, and oversight is approached with humility rather than authority. The system has reshaped itself around a reality it cannot dominate. Vought releases a public statement acknowledging the need for transparency and partnership moving forward, language that would have been unthinkable weeks earlier. The announcement is received calmly, without outrage or celebration, as if people expected this outcome all along. The world has adjusted its expectations quietly. Homelander watches from a distance as Saitama finishes his snack and tosses the wrapper into a nearby bin. He understands now that the dominance he once relied on has been replaced by something he cannot compete with, indifference that changes everything simply by existing. This realization settles into him as a permanent truth. The decisive outcome is not an explosion or confrontation, but a world that no longer reacts to power the way it used to. Fear has lessened, spectacle has faded, and authority has softened into something more cautious. Saitama stands up, stretches slightly, and walks down the street without any awareness that the world has permanently changed because of him.